Miracles. Excuse me. Miracles. These stories sure stand out, and they elicit all kinds of responses from us. We hear or we read a miracle story and we think, amazing, fantastic, unbelievable, brilliant, impossible, astonishment. All sorts of reactions might go through our head. Whatever our reaction might be, what I think is fascinating is Jesus' attitude towards them. We read or we hear a miracle story and we're struck by the miracle. That's the thing that stands out. We're not too worried about the wee sentences that follow after these incidents, such as Mark chapter 1, the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, when Jesus starts his work and he actually heals some people, and basically in that first day, he leaves the town to go into a quiet place to pray, and his disciples come searching for him, and they say, "Come back, everybody's looking for you." And Jesus answered, we must go to the other villages round about here. I have to preach in them too. That's why I came. Or a few verses later in that same chapter, just as an example, we hear about Jesus healing a man who's got some horrible skin disease. And what did he do? He says to the man in the next sentence, "Listen, don't tell anyone about this." Imagine, what chance did Jesus have saying to the man, "Don't tell anyone about this"? But that's what he said. You see, if we look carefully, we'll discover that Jesus had quite a surprising view of miracles. It's true, if he was faced with suffering, he was moved with compassion. But the surprising fact is, much of the time, Jesus was very reluctant to perform a miracle. He tried to get out of an area whenever he'd performed one. As he usually involved healing, he knew he would soon, if not immediately, be under pressure to bring instant healing to a whole lot of other people. And he told people not to let on what had happened to them when they were healed, because he knew that miracles can end up being the things that people really wanted to see. He realized that people might even decide to follow him because of these magic tricks he seemed to be able to do. And of course, we know that turned out to be true. There were people who started following him, just looking out to see what he might do. And he realized that he, as a messenger, might end up being more important than the message, this message that God wanted him to proclaim to the world. And he realized that if this message has got the power to influence every single person in the world from years to come, all time, miracles are only going to be relevant to a limited amount of people in his first century neighborhood. And he realized that the Pharisees might try to bait him by taunting him and asking him to perform miracles just for them. And he realized from the very beginning, at the wilderness temptations, before his work really began, that a show of power would be a very quick way for him to become a celebrity and to become popular and to find favor with people. It was a shortcut to success. But he realized that wasn't what God was calling him to do. And he realized that miracles, whilst amazing sounding events, are always temporary things. The lame man he healed, the blind man he cured, the little child he raised, the woman with the bleeding that he restored. All of these people would eventually come to the end of their lives and die. Every person's life comes to an end. Any healings, however welcome, can't change the fact they're temporary. And he realized that miracles don't necessarily produce faith. And that might seem like a strange thing, but it's absolutely true. I knew a woman once, I'll call her Shona, who grew up in the community of faith, and we both shared some friends in common. And after a while, she just drifted away from Christianity, and she married a guy, and this guy was an atheist, and he was very, very anti-faith. And so she didn't hang out with anybody from the faith world anymore. She got rid of all her Christian friends. And that was okay. But then some years later, when she was still young, a terrible thing happened. Out of the blue, she was at hospital and they discovered she had cancer. And they hadn't discovered it before, and it was so advanced, it was so bad, it was inoperable. And they told her, you'll need to put your things in order. You're going to die. And as she contemplated her death, her imminent death, some of the old friends from the past had found out about this and got in touch with her and said, why don't you go to the healing rooms? There's a healing rooms near you. People could pray for you. People could pray for healing. And Shona was scornful of that. I don't believe all that stuff anymore. That's a lot of rubbish, all that Christian stuff. And then her friend said, what have you got to lose? You're going to die? What would you lose by going? So she went, and the people there prayed for her. They prayed for her healing. And when she turned up at the hospital for her next appointment, there was some problem because they couldn't find trace of any cancer. And the medics couldn't believe it. All the cancer had just disappeared. And they put it down to an unknown and inexplainable cause. How could that have happened? Shona was, as you might imagine, very, very happy indeed, and very, very happy at how things turned out. But if you ask her now, after these events, she still doesn't believe in God. So Jesus realized that his job was not to supply the world with miracles. That was not his job. But today, we've got a miracle story. In fact, we've got two in one, a very memorable story. We've got a woman and we've got a girl, and they're both in deep, deep trouble. But other than that, they couldn't be much more different. One is a very young girl. Her whole life is lying ahead of her. The other is fully grown and maybe up in years. She might even be an elderly woman. One suddenly becomes ill, just out of nothing. The other has been chronically ill for many years. One is the young daughter of a prominent citizen, respected person. And the other is on her own, with no known relations. The wee girl, if not herself rich, is certainly part of one of the wealthiest families in town. Whereas the woman is poor, and what money she ever had, she spent on trying to find a cure for herself. But there's a link between these two very opposite-sounding people. They show the extreme poles, the two most extreme poles of society at that time. You see, that older woman is not respectable because of her illness. Her illness makes her unclean. And because it makes her unclean, she's to be ignored. She has to be shunned. She has to stay out of normal life. And she can't even be a part of worship. She is rejected by God and to be kept away from God's presence. And because it was believed in those days, if you were ever ill, then God had made you ill, because in those days they believed everything that happened was what God did. So it was implicitly believed that God didn't like this woman for whatever reason, and God had sent that illness to her. So that's her. And then on the other side, there's this 12-year-old girl born into this very respectable society, but her dad is the leader of this synagogue, the main man and pillar of the community. And he would be the very person who would have laid down the law about keeping the older women out and away from worship That would have been his job to do that. He would have been at the heart of that older woman's trouble. So this guy is called Jairus. He's in a very interesting position. On the one hand, he's one of these people who insists that this older sick woman should be kept away from worship and society and condemned just because of her illness, believing that God had rejected her. And on the other hand, he would like God, in the person of Jesus, to be healing his daughter. So, in the middle of this journey to Jairus' house, they're walking through the town. And in the middle of this journey, Jesus feels something's happening, and he stops to single out this woman who came up and touched him. And he calls her my daughter. And he praises her. He says, your faith has made you well. Instead of ignoring her like everyone else, Jesus does the opposite. He goes out of his way to find her and identify with her. And instead of belittling her as a sinner, he praises her as a true daughter of Israel. And by setting her free from the illness, he has simultaneously set her free from the stigma that surrounded it. No longer does she need to be ignored. No longer should she be considered second class or shunned. No longer can people exclude her from worship. The barriers put up against her now come tumbling down. Sure, Jesus felt Jairus' pain too. And next, he moves on to his house and goes on to heal his wee girl, because he had compassion for them too. God's love is for everyone. But Jesus knew what he was doing that day, and he was doing it publicly for everybody to see. And as well as the healing for Jairus' daughter, there was a challenge for Jairus and his beliefs. You see, the Jewish religious law was concerned with this idea of being clean or being unclean. This was like a big thing. Following the rules of the law, this older woman was unclean. So Jesus should not have touched her. He was breaking the law to touch her. As long as she had that illness, she would just remain unclean permanently. And then once Jesus did touch her, Jesus was now unclean, and therefore he shouldn't have touched the wee girl, because then she would be unclean too. So in other words, here's two souls in distress, needing healing, but according to the religious law, neither of them is to be healed. And Jesus showed his audience that day what he thought of such nonsense. The Jewish people thought the illness is the big reality, but it was Jesus' touch that had superior power. His was the cleansing power and the cleaning power. He was not the person to get contaminated himself, that he wasn't bringing on himself illness. He was the giver of health for both of them. Jesus' touch made these two people whole and well. So, Jesus was able to teach through his healings and miracles, as well as to bring hope and help to people in need. As I mentioned last Sunday, whenever there's a miracle story in the Gospels, there is always a deeper thing going on. There's a deeper story behind it. There's a deeper meaning behind any miracle story. They don't just stand as their own as something amazing or perhaps impossible or unlikely. There's always something behind them for us to learn. But today's point needs to be made again, that Jesus knew that whatever some people might think, miracles were not the heart of his message. Now, we are the church, and we have to continue to find ways to continue the work of Jesus. And if miracles are central, then we are in deep trouble, because we cannot provide miracles. So what then is the heart of Jesus' message? If the miracles were the sort of standout things, the things that hit the headlines, what was the heart of his message? What is the heart of this message that needs to be applied around the world in every age. Here's 3 quick, simple ideas. The first, his message was to teach people about God. It seems like human beings have pretty much a universal experience of believing that there's a God, or that there's a source of life, or there is something bigger or something more, or there might be something out there. Jesus came to make God clearer. Jesus came to show that God is not some mysterious thing out there, some impersonal force, but that God can be known and loved and trusted. Jesus came to show that God's biggest attribute is love, and that God actually loves us. Despite all the mistakes we make, God continues to will our best. Second, it was to teach people the value and the danger of religion. Jesus followed a distinct path, a religious path. He had as his spiritual tradition, and that's very, very obvious, goes without saying. But religion is never perfect. No religion is ever perfect. And his trouble with the religious teachers was symptomatic with the trouble of religion in general. There's a way in which religion can end up teaching things that go against God, which distort what God is like, and how we should live, and how we should treat one another. So being aware of religion's tendency to make mistakes was a key part of Jesus' message. And even today, we see in Christianity some of the troubles between Jesus and the religious leaders being played out. Still being played out. It happens in every generation. Still there's an argument about what matters most. Is it what we believe, or is it what we do? Is it about compassion, or is it about rules? Or between who's in God's favour, who's out of God's favour, about whether God is really a wrathful king or whether God is love itself. And the reason why we have these encounters between Jesus and the religious leaders recorded for us in the Bible, the reason why they are there is to keep us on our toes. So we can ask ourselves whether maybe in our day we might be promoting a faith that's got its priorities all wrong. That it's all about rules instead of love. Or where it seems like the trivial things are more important than the deepest things. Or where we're more keen on rejection than acceptance of other people. So that's why exposing or calling out the failure in religion can be part of the good news. That's what Jesus did. And that's what we must do too. And the third thing is Jesus' message was a call to us to be in a relationship with God. Jesus came to teach about a God who wants to be with us in relationship, to help us live our lives to the full, where we draw nearer to God ourselves through worship and through prayer and reflection and action, and we grow in our understanding of God, and where we offer ourselves to work with God in making the world a better place. So it was to remind people that God wants to work with them in the kingdom of God. God chooses to work with humans always, in every age. God calls us to be part of that project. So, in return for this relationship with God, for knowing that we're loved and accepted by God, God simply asks us to share that good news with those around us. So that's a lightning quick summing up of the message of Jesus. Jesus came to teach us about God, to teach us the value and the danger of religion, and to call us into relationship with God. Our job is not to create or recreate or produce miracles. Our job is to share the reality of God and show how the teachings of Jesus are relevant and important for people today. To stick with the main message of Jesus, to make it relevant to the time that we're living in and to the place where we are situated, and to strive to make Langside Church an active outpost of God's kingdom right here and now. May God bless us all in that task. Thanks be to God.